first talk about localizing the 2030 agenda and other development frameworks. And as just mentioned, this is represented by the outer circle of our SERM diagram. And maybe let's take a step back, because not everybody, of course, is so intimately familiar with international development work. And so let's look at what international development agendas are and which ones are important. In 2015 and in 2016, national governments adopted several important global development frameworks or agendas. And that means they agreed to implement principles, processes, and activities in order to jointly progress on development worldwide. And 5 of the most important agendas for us are the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is kind of the overarching one. Then we have the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the new Urban Agenda out of the Habitat 3 process, and the Addis Abeba Action Agenda from the 3rd International Conference for Financing for Development. So now that countries have signed these agreements a few years back, they are supposed to embed them into national and local development policies, plans, and budgets. And significant parts of these global development agendas need to be aligned to local level needs, or in other words, localized. And then they can be tools for achieving more sustainable urban resource management, among several other development goals. Let's start maybe at the very beginning for those who are not so familiar with sustainable development, and let's remind ourselves what sustainable development is. The concept has been with us for quite a few decades. It took a long time to kind of be accepted as the mainstream, but I think it's fair to say now that it is in the mainstream, and maybe one of its chief challenges is that it's actually so comprehensive that it becomes difficult to implement all at once. But anyway, a very common definition of sustainable development comes from the Brundtland report, and it says sustainable development meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And then we very often see that sustainable development is divided into 3 dimensions: the economic, the social, and the environmental dimensions. And very often nowadays also governance is added either as a base or as a collecting roof, permeating these 3 dimensions. Also very often you probably have seen the 3 dimension represented in overlapping circles of a Venn diagram, but we here on purpose have picked this visual representation because it shows a hierarchy of these 3 dimensions, which we feel reflects reality better, and that is that the largest dimension is the environment, it's the biosphere, the natural environment of Earth and even the universe with the sun shining in. And society, really, human society is a subset of this larger biosphere and dependent on it. And then the economy, yet again, is a subset of human society, depending on that. And I think it's very important to bear this hierarchy in mind when making up economic decisions or more sustainable development decisions, because it all has to be done within the carrying capacity of the biosphere. So, as already mentioned, the 2030 Agenda is the overarching global development framework, and it wants to create a bottom line of 5 Ps. That means it wants to have development for people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. And one of the pledges that governments gave is to leave no one behind and reach the furthest behind first. And aside from these principles, the 2030 Agenda has 17 sustainable development goals, and each of these goals has several targets, and each of these targets has several indicators. And this SDG framework allows us to define in more detail what actually sustainable development under the 2030 Agenda should include, and also allows us to measure whether we are progressing by having a baseline and by having targets towards which we want to progress. And these SDGs, these Sustainable Development Goals, they have been declared as universal, integrated, and indivisible. So that means not one SDG is more important than the others, and all 17 of them have to be achieved in order for the agenda to be successful. So development has to be balanced across the 3 pillars and governance. And because the writing of the goals themselves is a bit small, on the screen you can also see keywords for the 17 goals. So they range from poverty, hunger, health, education, gender, to water, energy, and so on. You can read it. For us, very important is cities, sustainable consumption and production, number 12, and then also 16 and 17, which are more process goals in a sense, because they call for partnership and stronger institutions and participation and so on. Now, a question. Look at this picture, and which SDGs do you see in it? And you will notice the longer you look at the picture, the more aspects you actually identify. And if you do this exercise long enough, you will be able to link all 17 SDGs to something that you can see in this picture, because it either exists or you can see the impact of the lack of it. And this, of course, is a very powerful message. It drives home that cities or local areas really are at the center of implementing all SDGs, and not just SDG 11, which is focused on sustainable cities and communities. And so really localizing the SDGs meets the reality of cities. And here are some statistics and trends that you can see for the region. Basically, since last year, we are now half urban. Cities are the main drivers of the economy, but all this quick urbanization and economic growth has led to increased inequality and exclusion, and this is very visible by still very large populations living in slums. Also, the way that cities have grown, they have actually not reduced vulnerability to shocks and disasters, and so we are not very well prepared for the changes in climate. Moreover, in Asia and the Pacific, we are the most resource inefficient region in the world, and the trends, they're going in the wrong direction. So our resource use here is intensifying, especially in developing countries. And to sum it all up with the words of the former UN Secretary General, our struggle for global sustainability will be won or lost in cities. So why is localizing important? What is it? It means taking these international agendas and taking them to the subnational context and looking at subnational challenges and opportunities. It really is a process, and as such, it is calling for co-creating solutions and for establishing or strengthening meaningful partnerships. This is also a way to achieve the global SDG agenda through bottom-up action, and it provides local development policy with a wider framework, and therefore the SDGs or the 2030 agenda and the other agendas can really become catalysts of change to achieve the global goals. And when we're talking about localizing, we're both talking about localizing the normative principles of the agenda and also translating the goals with targets and indicators to the local level. And last but not least, of course, localizing also means to localize the means of implementation, and that means sufficient finance and also capacity in form of knowledge and human resources and so on. And that also includes strengthening the evidence base, so more data and information, and thinking in more integrated ways. I just want to zoom into two sustainable development goals that are particularly important for us here for sustainable urban resource management, just to make it a little bit less abstract and to really show how rich the targets within each SDG are. And here you see SDG 11. On the left-hand side, there is a comic which kind of summarizes nicely what SDG 11 is all about. And then on the right-hand side is a table which shows you summaries of the targets and indicators. And just to summarize, SDG 11 focuses on housing and basic services, on transport, on planning, on cultural and natural heritage, on reducing losses and deaths from disaster, on reducing the negative environmental impacts of cities, and in particular here, air quality and solid waste management, on better access and more safety in public spaces, on urban-rural linkages, and on DRR, resource efficiency and climate policies, as well as rather specifically on supporting LDCs in developing green building concepts. So as you see, a lot of issues that cities have really come under the goal. The other goal that is at the very core of our project is SDG 12, which is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. And that goal very much takes from the 10-year sustainable consumption and production framework of UN Environment. We will talk about this in detail in another webinar, as this is just the overview one. But basically, it includes sustainable management of natural resources, the reduction of food waste along the entire value chain, the better management of hazardous chemicals and wastes, an effective implementation of the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, reduce, recycle, more sustainable practices by companies, which are at the core of production, more sustainable public procurement practices, which basically try to implement above, public awareness, so consumption can also move in the right direction, strengthening the scientific and technological capacity, and very specifically, again, also supporting sustainable tourism. And interestingly, it also calls for removing harmful subsidies that are not helping sustainable production consumption, for example, those for fossil fuels. So, for this is substantive focus of sustainable urban resource management, certain SDGs at the goal level are absolutely key, and I've just introduced in detail SDG 11 on cities and SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production. Others that are at this core are SDG 7 on energy, SDG 8 on growth and jobs, SDG 9 on infrastructure, SDG 13 on climate, 14 on oceans, and 15 on life on Earth. However, life on land. However, as the principles of the 2030 agenda call for a balanced implementation of all goals and of the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, when we looked into developing our project approach for sustainable urban resource management, we decided to, aside from the green resource concepts, to bring in a few more components, and this is why we ended up with the 4 components that I mentioned earlier: linear to circular, pro-poor, gender responsive, and resilient. And then it starts making more sense to look at the target levels of the 2030 agenda. And you can see here the wheel on the left-hand side. We identified 79 targets within all 17 SDGs as directly relevant to the implementation of sustainable urban resource management. And so this is kind of the targets and indicators that we would start focusing on when implementing at local level. Of course, the 2030 agenda is not the only agenda, and it would be remiss of us if we only focus on it and not bring in the other development agendas. And so we really try to localize them jointly. They have natural overlaps. For example, the new urban agenda can be seen as a roadmap or an implementation manual of the SDGs in cities. And really, 2/3 of all SDG targets directly reflect local government mandates in most countries. And therefore, it's fair to say that the NUA is linked to the SDGs at all levels, or at all 17 SDGs, and that's why there is a blue circle around it. The same is true for the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, because all the SDGs need financing. But especially SDGs 16 and 17 focus on the means of implementation, and there it also lists financing as a key section, and therefore Addis Ababa also all SDGs. And then Paris and Sendai, they have more specific aims in terms of climate change and disaster risk reduction, and they interlink with SDG 1, 2, 11, and 13 most closely. And even for Sendai, there are similar indicators that measure both the SDG framework and the Sendai framework. So there are lots of overlaps, and of course, as we mentioned, there is also the 10-year framework plan for sustainable consumption and production. More helpful platforms and initiatives for localizing the SDGs and the other agendas are, for example, these 4, but that's, of course, by no means comprehensive or complete. This brings to an end the discussion of the outer circle of our diagram.